our webinar today, Impairing Fixed Assets and FSM. Steve, if you want to go to the next slide, please. So we're going to go through our agenda. I'm going to hit the company overview. So if we just go right to the company overview, here we go. If you're not familiar with Bales, I'd like to take a second to tell you about us. We have been in the Infor ecosystem for over 26 years. We're entirely Infor focused. We do nothing but Infor implementations, upgrades, and managed services. We support all aspects of the technology, including S3, Landmark, and Cloud Suite, including HRM, HCM, finance, and supply. In fact, we've been recognized and given partner awards in 8 of the last 10 years. Our consultants bring 15 plus years of consulting experience in the space and the equivalent in professional experience. Some were former benefit managers, compensation managers, directors of supply chain, as well as former controllers and CFOs. Exciting news for the Infor community. Earlier this month, Bales became part of Nordic, an industry-leading healthcare consulting firm. Bales will be wholly owned and subsidiary and continue to be led by Jamie Bales. Nordic will provide us with resources to fund our growth, expand our business, and support our customers more effectively. For healthcare customers, it allows us to bring together Nordic's capabilities in the EHR space to provide a more holistic solution, including specific expertise in EHR and ERP integration. This combination will offer a best practice to reduce implementation risks and leveraging the data from both systems to drive insights and outcomes. Again, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Here is Steve Sinisi, one of our senior consultants.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, my name's Steve Sinisi, Senior Consultant with Bales, and today we want to go through a presentation on the asset impairment functionality that's in the Infor Finance and Supply Management module in their version 11 software. This is something that a lot of companies need to do their asset impairments, and doing it in prior versions kind of required you to do an adjustment in the system and make journal entries on the GL side. And there was never a way to really make it happen from the asset management side. So in version 11, they've included this functionality, and we're going to walk through what it takes to set that up in your software and what the processing and accounting looks like. It's pretty straightforward. It's pretty simple, and there is some documentation out on infordocs.com to accomplish this. But we wanted to make sure that Infor's clients are aware of this functionality and that they know how the setup can be done and how it works in the system. So I'll start with kind of what is an asset impairment for those on the call who may not know. It's a permanent decline in the book value of an asset, and this can occur for a number of different reasons. It can happen because of damage to an asset, decreased profitability at the location of the asset, market changes, anything that's affecting the value of the asset can require a company to impair the asset. I used to work as a fixed asset accountant at a retail company, and every year we would have locations that we were planning on closing. And once we knew that close date, we would have to impair the assets and adjust the useful life of the asset and impair the cost of the assets. And we always had to kind of track that outside of the system, and there wasn't a direct way to do it. So we're talking about impairments today because that functionality is now integrated into FSM, and the process automatically creates the journal entries for the GL, and it allows you to easily keep track of your impaired assets and all the entries that are made for asset impairments. So first, I want to walk through the setup with you. The first step is on the asset company. So on the asset company, you're going to see a checkbox for impairment, and that's the one that's in the red box on the screen. And we just want to flag that company to be able to use asset impairment. The next step is on any asset types that we're going to do impairments for. We're going to select the impairment checkbox on the asset type. So if you have some asset types where you never have to do impairments, you don't have to select the impairment box on that asset type. So in this example, we're looking at a furniture, fixture, and equipment asset type, and we've checked the box for impairment on the main tab. Once you select that impairment box on the main tab, you're going to get a tab for impairment accounts. And so this is where you're going to have to fill in the GL accounts for all of the impairment entries that can be made. We're going to look at some of the entries that actually get made in the system a little bit later, but you can see we're having to fill out GL account information for impairment additions, adjustments, transfers, and disposals. The next step in the setup is we have to create an asset book specifically for impairments. So this book is going to track any assets that are flagged for impairment and that are making impairment entries. So it's actually a separate asset book from your financial book. And you'll see we're going to tie the two together. But we have to create a new book. I've called this book Impair, and I have flagged the asset book to use for impairment. So whenever you create an asset book in Infor, we also have to create a book calendar for that asset book. This book calendar should match your financial book calendar or your GL book calendar because they're going to be tied together. So it should have the same begin and end date for the year. It should have the same number of total periods and the same number of periods closed. And it should be a posting book because we are going to make journal entries to the GL, but it should not be a required book because we are not requiring that all assets go through the impairment book. Only the assets that we select for impairment are going to go through this impairment book. The last step is we need to attach that impairment book that we created to the GL book or the financial asset book. So you can see on this tab, I've opened our financial book and I've attached the impairment book on the impairment book field. And that's all the setup that's needed to start using the impairment functionality. The setup's pretty quick, as you can see. And we'll look in the next step what processing an impairment is going to look like. So once you have the setup complete, if you open an asset whose asset type has been set up for impairment, you'll see an impair button on the main asset screen. So right where you would normally see your transfer and dispose options, you'll have a new option to impair the asset. And we're going to say that we're going to go in and impair this asset. So we would click that impair button. And it's going to ask us for a description for the impairment. It's going to ask for an impairment date for the impairment to start. It's going to populate the operator in the system who's doing the impairment. And it's going to allow you to attach any documentation that you want. So this could be email correspondence, Word documents, Excel files with calculations for the impairments, PDFs, any type of document from your desktop, you'll be able to attach to the impairment, and you can go back to it anytime. And other users in the system, when they open the asset, will be able to see any attachments for the impairment. Okay, so we've told the system we want to do an impairment. Now we need to enter the impairment amount. And if you look at the very bottom of the screen, we see a line where we've added an impairment for the asset. And it tells us some information about the asset, the life remaining, the basis, the book value. We need to input an impairment amount. So that gets entered as a negative. So in this example, I've got a $10,000 asset with a book basis of $10,000, and I'm impairing it down $5,000. After I enter that impairment amount, I want to hit save on the screen, and then I'm going to get two options that come up, two buttons that are in red here, release or reset impairment. When I release the impairment, that's going to actually have the impairment take effect in the system and send the entry to GL. Or if I reset the impairment, that's basically going to undo what I did with the impairment amount and get rid of the impairment as if it never happened. So this is a good kind of break in the process where if you need to do some type of review process, perhaps you have an asset accountant go in and do your asset impairment, and you want a manager or a controller to come through and review the impairments before they go over to GL. They can come out here if they know which assets they're looking for, review any documentation that was attached, review the impairment amount, and they could be the ones who release the impairment. So that was how to process an impairment. Now we'll take a look at the accounting for the impairment and what that looks like in the system. So when we release that impairment, the system is going to debit the impairment write-off expense account, and it's going to credit the impairment charge reversal account, which is an asset account that we would set up. So in the example that we're doing here, we've reduced our assets by $5,000, and we've recognized a $5,000 expense on the income statement. Then we're going to get another entry at month end. So when we run our depreciation and close asset management for the month, the impairment amount is going to be amortized based on the remaining life of the asset. So you can see the entry is going to net against depreciation until the asset's fully depreciated. So we've got a debit to accumulated amortization for the asset and a credit to impairment amortization on the expense side. Going back to the asset tab, we're going to see an impairment tab on the asset, and you can go back to this at any time and open that tab to show all the entries related to the impairment. So this is a quick way that you can track all of your impairment information, that you can pull it out of the system anytime you need. So obviously this is great for audits or just your own internal tracking of your asset impairments. That was the process for setting up asset impairments, processing them in the system, and then looking at the accounting behind the asset impairment functionality. Does anyone have any questions on any of those steps?
Looks like we're good, Steve.
Okay, I think Brian has recorded this. So if this is something that you are looking at setting up for your organization, you can use the recording to help you do the setup. There is documentation on Infor Docs for asset impairments. One thing I would recommend is that you set this up in a training or testing environment, and you run through the processing steps, and you send the entries over to GL, and you make sure that the accounting matches what your organization does for asset impairments. And once you've got it all working, just move that setup over to production, and you should be good to go.
Okay. Thank you all for joining. If you have any questions or would like to have an opportunity to speak with one of our consultants for a half-hour free time, please reach out to us. This is an offering we call Coffee with Consultants. So please visit us at www.balesllc.com to reach out to us, and we would get you set up. This ends our webinar series for the month of February. We're going to be taking a break for the month of March, and we will resume in April. So please be on the lookout at Work Out Loud for the dates, and we'll also be sending out invitations to prior attendees. So thanks all, and you can find us again on our website, these recordings and other recordings, the webinars that we had this past month. Thank you, and have a good day. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, guys.
Have a good day.